There are really interesting links and connections there, even though, again, we will stay with narrative fiction, and we will address the issue of presence, the feeling of being there, and how it gets established by a written narrative. That material is something that is based on an article which Federico, I, and two colleagues wrote together, which you can read on the Open Science, Open Research Europe platform, as well as some of my previous work on narrative fiction and predictive processing. And we'll use the talk today to tie together different strands, but also to open up possible future developments. Predictions play an important role in how readers understand the plot of a literary narrative. So if we take the example of the fairy tale Briar Rose, where you have the first sentence on the slide, we see that at the beginning, the king and queen wish for a child, but they do not get one. This would be a first prediction error. But then in the next sentence, actually the queen conceives, after all, despite what the narrator just said. So that would be a second prediction error, this time on the level of the narration. Narrative meaning making then develops as readers develop their inferences along a sequence of prediction errors. So plot could be defined as a sequence of prediction errors. And readers reach the hopefully happy ending whenever there are no further prediction errors deployed to disturb their expectations. Yet the question arises what predictive processing then has to say about the phenomenon of presence. Presence is normally conceived as the sense of being there in a real, virtual, imagined, fictional place. And the second related concept is that of narrative absorption, which is a state characterized by heightened sense of focused attention on the story, transportation into the fictional world, emotional engagement with characters, and activated mental imagery. And it's a term that's been particularly developed by Monique Kuipers. So the question that we want to investigate is, how do these phenomena relate to the sequence of prediction errors we have observed for the plot? After all, if you look at the opening sentence from the Grimms, it doesn't exactly evoke presence. And secondly, how can we model presence in reading literature through predictive processing? The problem for literature as a medium lies in the literary text. Literature poses some serious challenges for the discussion of presence because black and white letters on the page do not exactly provide rich material for sensory perception. So here it's really different from film or other visual media. Instead, literature is a low bandwidth medium, only enriched in exceptional cases through voices and performance in reading out loud, through social interaction in reading audiences, or as in the case of the picture you see here, through illustrations in the book.
So a critical issue to consider for mediated experience is whether there is a difference between presence in relation to a word displayed in a virtual reality environment, for instance, where users can often interact with it, from presence in relation to a narrative, which concerns the way a story is told and the imagined world it elicits. In other words, shall we distinguish immersion in a story world from immersion in a virtual reality world? The intuitive fact that people can perceive a strong sense of presence in an imagined world created on the basis of very simple sensory stimulus like words on paper is known in VR research as the book problem. And to solve the book problem, Frank Biocca suggests that, quote, books achieve their level of presence by making heavy use of the imagery space to fill in the spatial model cued by the book. The details of the egocentric spatial model generated by the book are generated largely from memory. So in some ways, the presence of books contains components of the virtual space and imagery space. But unlike an immersive 3D virtual environment, there is a higher component of imagery space, end of quote. So we think there are a few shortcomings in this account. It is a bit of a stretch to consider the spatial model cued by a book as similar to an actual 3D virtual space, because as Max and Sam also said, Visual mental imagery is not the only kind of mental imagery deployed in reading. And fictional words do not give full spatial representations of everything within them. In brief, we think it's not necessary to postulate a mental imagery space, since all cognitive spatial models are embodied mental simulations. Thus, they are partly generated recurring to previous experiences, like memories and sensory motor scripts. Moreover, discoveries about brain activation during embodied simulation processes weaken the distinction between mediated experiences based on audiovisual interactive stimuli and those based only on a stimulus. For instance, we do not actually move our body while reading about the fictional character Don Quixote riding a horse, but our brain activation of sensory motor areas is not that different than if we were actually riding a horse. In the framework of predictive processing, the way interactive and non-interactive mediated experiences affect our spatiotemporal perception may not require distinct concepts, despite different theorizations that have been proposed by different disciplines. Regardless of the context of or use of media, presence and narrative absorptions are phenomena based on embodied predictive processing. And let's see how this works. So the enactment of predictions can occur mainly in three contexts: through the body in a non-mediated way, in first-order mediation, that is through a proximal physical or symbolic tool, where we use an artifact directly with our body, including language, and to exert an action upon an object. Or in second-order mediation, that is through a proximal physical or symbolic tool that controls one or more distal tools, like a tool perceivable in the extrapersonal space, such as an avatar or a narrative. And we use this distal tool then to exert an action upon an external object, like when we use a gamepad to control an avatar in a video game, or to exert an action on a mental object, like when we give sense to a narrative or we solve a thought experiment. Second-order mediated actions are based on the simultaneous handling of two different body models, one centered on the body and a second one centered on the external tool. These two body models are weighted in a way that minimizes uncertainty during the mediated action. In other words, the second peripersonal space centered on the external tool competes with the one centered on the body to orient action and perception. Namely, when the externally centered peripersonal space becomes the most relevant one, like when reading a fiction, attention shifts from the body-centered space to the one surrounding the external symbolic tool. From a phenomenological viewpoint, the agent is, in this case, present in the external space and can act in it intuitively. That is, we enact predictions about characters acting in a story world. The issue here is, what happens when our predictions about characters and the story world are wrong? This happens quite often because authors like to play with their audience and create suspense or surprising effects, for instance. In these cases, is presence in the story world disrupted and our attention is suddenly brought back to our physical world? We can explain these dynamics if we consider that we can have different types of intentions. We have motor intentions that coordinate the simplest motor actions and are not directed towards an object. We have proximal intentions, which are the basis of actions directed towards states, objects, or agents in the surrounding environment. And we have distant intentions, which are at the basis of our actions towards states, objects, and agents in possible worlds, that is, non-actual worlds linked to the actual one by a relation of accessibility. So why is this distinction important? Because in the case of mediated actions, different types of intentions are at play and can be in conflict. In second-order mediated actions, an agent has two intentions. The first one is of the kind to use language to enact the actions of the character, and this is a kind of proximal intention. The second one is of the kind to understand the character's intention, and this is a distal intention. So this distal intention happens by progressively reconstructing the probability design of the novel, and then using it to make accurate predictions of what a character will do or feel. Through the story, A reader progressively learns to enact the character's present intentions, taking into account the future intentions envisaged in the narrative organization, like plot, genre conventions, and tropes, etc. This results in an increased sense of agency, because the reader perceives themselves as able to master mediated and simulated exteroception and interoception. Moreover, it can be the case that successful predictions of the narrative's proximal and distal intentions match a reader's own intentions. For instance, when the desire to read a suspenseful romance and the belief that everyone has a soulmate, like it may be narrated in the story. In this situation, the sense of presence can be further intensified, since the reader successfully performs two actions. The first one is interpreting and accepting the narrative organization, and the second action is confirming the reader's own self-perception after an exploration of their own feelings and beliefs prompted by the narrative. But let's see this with an example. This passage from The Sleeping Beauty in the French version by Charles Perrault reads, "Hardly had he taken a step towards the wood when the tall trees, the brambles and the thorns separated of themselves and made a path for him. He turned in the direction of the castle and espied it at the end of a long avenue. This avenue he entered and was surprised to notice that the trees closed up again as soon as he had passed, so that none of his retinue were able to follow him." So in the case of surprise, the medium-content combination is designed to exploit prediction errors in order to create an experience that induces breaks in presence, by attracting selective attention towards the narrative elements on which the wrong prediction was based, and towards the new element that revealed the error. In this story excerpt, the supernatural event reveals an error in our predictions generated by the proximal intention of enacting the character's movement in the wood. However, at the same time, sustained attention is focused on the broader narrative context in which the prediction error occurred. So the distant intention related to the processing of the whole narrative allows the generative system to assign less precision to errors coming from presence, which emerge at a lower level and can be minimized through epistemic active inference. This happens because we reconfigure knowledge about the plot in light of the overall information provided by the narrative. In this example, a supernatural event, the moving of the trees, proves our predictions wrong, but we make sense of it by recurring to higher level knowledge and intentions. It's a fairy tale and supernatural stuff can happen. And our distal intention is to find out whether the prince will succeed in waking up the princess. So now the more technical explanation of the overall framework. These dynamics between storyboard, character's perspective, and reader's intentions are guided by hierarchical relations between various subjective phenomenal states: agency, spatial presence, social presence, and narrative absorption. Hierarchically higher states can constrain predictions generated by lower level states, intensifying or inhibiting them. Intentions are crucial for distinguishing between the different presence-related phenomena. It is mainly the processing of intentions oriented towards external objects in comparison to exteroceptive signals that enable spatial presence, whereas intentions oriented towards other agents and updated on the basis of their actions enable social presence, and this includes fictional characters. And intentions oriented towards interoceptive states enable narrative absorption. So in this model, differently from what Anil said and others said, we conceive presence as a neurophysiological phenomenon whose goal is to generate in the embodied self a sense of agency that supervises predictions related to both exteroceptive and interoceptive perception. So an agent feels present when they are able to correctly and intuitively enact their embodied predictions. And presence is an expression of the self-perceived skillful agency of an embodied mind. And it is a hierarchically higher than agency, contrary to what Seth claimed. Predictions related to presence can be successfully enacted even in the case of prediction errors related to agency. In our model, presence is hierarchically higher and can constrain the perception of agency. Namely, an agent an agent can feel present even though they fail in enacting some motor intentions, like in the example of failing to enact the motor intentions of a character. In this view, the sense of presence can be considered as an evaluative tool used to track the difference between predicted sensations and those coming from bodily stimuli, both external and internal. The extent of this difference corresponds to the degree of self-perception as a skillful agent, which is the sense of presence. But let's look more in detail at what happens for each of these states. In the case of mediated experiences, multisensory stimuli affect the enactment of predictions in different ways with respect to physical digital tools, like playing with a ball or a video game, and with respect to symbolic tools, like when reading a narrative. The main difference is related to the precision attributed to the different layers of embodied predictions. Predictions related to physical digital tools and physical digital objects attribute a higher precision to exteroceptive and proprioceptive layers and/or vestibular information, according to the activity performed. Instead, predictions related to symbolic tools attribute a higher precision to interoceptive information. The precision attributed to interoceptive predictions and prediction errors is higher for symbolic tools. Using language, a proximal tool, is a first-order mediated action that, when successfully predicted, can enable the use of words to express and communicate inner states, extending the interoceptive accuracy of an agent. When speaking a mastered language and interacting with others using such language, an agent feels a stronger sense of agency and is able to better perceive, express, and interpret interoceptive stimuli. So the agent feels present because the correct prediction of the inner states increases the stability of the modeling of the near body space. On the other hand, reading fiction is a second-order mediated action in which an agent uses language to enact a character's action in the fictional world, and this action has an effect on the agent's interoceptive states. In this process, the precision of error signals is also weighted by different factors related mainly to mediation and to the medium format, but also to personal differences, as has been shown in empirical research. And also self-related variables like intentions or point of view influence the precision of the different layers and the different relevance assigned to them. But now Karin will go back to the book problem, clarifying how some of these factors operate.
We can attempt to solve the book problem in 2 steps. First, we propose to consider the mediation of the book. For the case of real-world perception, it has been argued by Pianzola and colleagues that the organism pursues free energy optimization also when we do not decide to lock ourselves up in a safe room and turn off the light, referring to the famous darkroom problem. The reason lies in the distinction between exteroception and interoception, so the perception of the world around us and the perception of our bodily states, heartbeat, breath, bodily sense of self, emotions, etc. According to Pianzola and colleagues, we keep interoceptive states stable so that we can be explorative in the world around us. In reading, on the other hand, the use of a distal tool like the narrative allows us to reverse that logic of homeostasis. In reading, keeping external states stable allows us to be adventurous and explorative regarding our inner states. And I guess we could say this is roughly a description of what novels do. The exploration of inner states can be linked to texts that provide mostly exteroceptive embodied language. In that case, readers experience a sense of mastery through manipulating language and narrative, generally speaking. This generates, as we have argued, a sense of presence. When texts, on the other hand, themselves provide interoceptive embodied language integrated with exteroceptive language, then a dual track of embodiment emerges in the literary text, which enhances the experience of presence further. Let's have a look at some examples. Going back to Briar Rose, in the version by the Brothers Grimm, the prince is moving through the enchanted palace where sleep has stopped all action in midair. This passage which you can see on the slide, shows how plot, movement, and embodiment are linked across narratological hierarchies. Only the prince can actually move around. Hence, he is the character whom readers follow in terms of proximal intentions for developing a sense of agency. At the same time, the overall narrative design works with distal intentions. Through the repetition of potential actions, as the prince moves into the palace, and then again, as he moves out, we have this repetition of the little scenes in the text there. Through those repetitions, readers pretty much get trained in becoming more skillful in navigating this narrative, more skillful in their perceived agency. And thereby the text itself supports readers in deploying distal intentions and developing the self-perceived skillful agency that is presence. The version by the Brothers Grimm foregrounds exteroception if we look at the kind of language it uses. Presents experience as externalized, almost like moving through a virtual reality, because readers get very little information about princes' inner states or perceptions. Arguably, this is the case because the Grimms collected their tales from oral storytellers, and because they wrote these stories so that they would be read out loud to children. The Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or fairy tales for children and household use, were indeed intended as a book to be used in a social setting. And the words on the page could be supplemented by the storyteller's voice, pacing, gestures, etc., thereby moderating the intro-exteroception trade-off while reading. Still, even in this version of the fairy tale, the phrase, "it was so quiet that he could hear his own breath," is evocative. And this is used as a counterpoint here to make the reader at this particular moment feel highly present. It is a rare reference for interoception, drawing second-order attention to readers' own interoceptive processes and thereby enhancing the embodied experience. In the more literary or more written version of Charles Perrault, the fairy tale Briar Rose shows a greater degree of integration between exteroceptive and interoceptive aspects of experience in the way in which it uses language. The prince remains the focal point, but now his actions are motivated by inner experiences that are expressed through the perception of inner states. A story that he hears about the enchanted castle fires the young prince. He jumped at the conclusion that it's his job to see this adventure through, and he feels impelled by love and glory. In fact, the English translation elides some of the way in which Perrault links epistemic and perceptual aspects of inner states in a combination of epistemic words and movement verbs that are then applied metaphorically to inner states. Like, for example, se sentit tout au feu, poussé, he feels pushed, sans se balancer, without hesitating, but of course also balancer has the sense of a physical balance. Here we have an integration of interoceptive and exteroceptive aspects of embodiment, which is a key marker of fictional narratives that feel real to readers. A development that starts in the early modern period, the time of Charles Perrault, and then comes to shape the 19th century novel. And of course, still today, it is a standard of fiction writing. To solve the book problem, then, it is not necessary to postulate an imaginary world that is rich in sensory detail. To feel present while reading, a simple set of language-based written cues is enough. If these cues make effective use of the shift of sensory selective attention from exteroception to interoception, and we have seen in Perrault and the Grimms what this can look like. First, the underlying neurophysiological dynamics are the same as for virtual reality or non-mediated experiences, involving predictive processing and enactment of intentions. In the case of activities more focused on exteroception, like moving an object in virtual reality, the brain makes predictions mainly in direct response to external signals, that is, related to the use of the VR controller and the outcomes seen in the VR scene. In the case of activities more focused on interoception, the external stimuli, that is, words on the page, are an input that activates embodied simulations, which in turn contribute to the emergence of cognitive and affective responses. In general, the two modes of embodied perception always work in combination, since interoception and emotions are always involved in a co-creation of our sensory motor perceptions, and external stimuli continuously influence the exploration of internal bodily states. Second, the literary text can then strike its own balance between words evoking interoceptive or exteroceptive embodied resonances in readers. As we have seen with the example from the different versions of Briar Rose, a sense of presence can emerge either through a representation of the explorative moves, as in the case of the prince, or through the integration of exteroceptive and interoceptive aspects of that experience. While literary texts clearly generate presence, they also offer challenges to the theoretical modeling of the phenomenon, even beyond the book problem. First, narrators often comment on the events, such as, for example, Perrault's offhand remark that it's quite obvious that a young prince in love is out for adventure. He's always valiant. Here, hyperpriors of genres and cultural generative models actually enhance presence for readers even if they're not strongly embodied, because they support the work of distal intentions. Second, even if texts are written, they might imitate other mediations, like, for example, the Grimms attempting to recreate oral storytelling. And third, through the hundreds of years of its development, narrative prose has shown substantial variation in the configuration of interoception and exteroception, as the comparison between the Grimms and Perrault already goes to show. And such historical change in style, especially when it occurs for the same story as with Briar Rose, can provide useful test cases for theorizing presence in literature, but also in aesthetic experience more generally.
So to conclude, to solve the book problem, we don't need to postulate the mental spaces or metaphorically talk about readers' transportation into the story world. Presence and narrative absorption are based on the same brain dynamics, regardless of whether they are activated by a direct body stimulus or a stimulus mediated by physical, digital, or symbolic tools. The difference between the various stimuli with respect to the emergence of this subjective phenomena lies in a shift of sensory selective attention between exteroceptive and interoceptive perception, and in the related attribution of a higher or lower precision to predictions based on each of the two kinds of perception. The book problem, in our view, should be addressed as the attribution of higher precision to interoception, with a consequent regulation of interoceptive signals, like emotions, by allocating more cognitive resources to their processing. Moreover, the interplay of intentions of different type, motor, proximal, and distal intentions, also intervenes in the process, relativizing prediction errors and breaks in presence at lower levels. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your question.